23 years of marriage dissolved the moment I walked into my own kitchen and found my husband Marcus teaching a 25-year-old how to use our espresso machine while she giggled in his Princeton University t-shirt. The same shirt I bought him for his 42nd birthday. The same kitchen where I'd made him breakfast every morning for over 2 decades. But what happened next when I introduced them both to my divorce lawyer will leave you speechless. Because sometimes the quiet wife knows more about her husband's secrets than he ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Chen, and at 51, I thought I knew everything about betrayal until I discovered what my husband had been hiding in plain sight. It started on a Thursday morning in October, the kind of crisp autumn day that used to make me feel grateful for our life in Westchester County. I had taken an early flight back from visiting my sister in Portland, cutting my trip short by 2 days because Marcus had texted me saying he missed me terribly and couldn't wait for me to come home. The house felt different when I walked in through the garage door. Not messy exactly, but shifted somehow, like furniture had been moved and put back almost correctly. The scent in the air was wrong too. Something floral and young that didn't belong in our carefully curated home with its neutral palette and expensive candles. I set my suitcase down in the mudroom and called out Marcus's name, but got no response except the distant sound of our fancy Italian coffee machine hissing to life. I walked through the hallway lined with photos of our travels, our dinner parties, our carefully documented life of success and sophistication. Marcus was a senior partner at a prestigious law firm in Manhattan, and I had spent the last decade building my interior design consultancy into something that attracted clients from the Upper East Side. We looked perfect on paper, and for years, I believed we were. The kitchen was flooded with morning sunlight when I stepped inside, and that's when I saw them. Marcus stood behind the marble island wearing nothing but boxer shorts and a t-shirt, his salt and pepper hair messy in a way that suggested he'd just rolled out of bed. Next to him stood a young woman with glossy black hair, and the kind of effortless beauty that comes from being 25 and never having worried about anything more serious than which filter to use on Instagram. She was wearing his Princeton shirt, the navy blue one with the faded orange tiger that I'd ordered special from the alumni store because he'd lost his original one from college. Her legs were bare, and she was laughing at something he'd said while steam rose from the milk frother in her perfectly manicured hand. Neither of them noticed me standing in the doorway, frozen between disbelief and a rage so pure it felt like ice water in my veins. Marcus was explaining the difference between a cappuccino and a flat white with the same patient tone he used to use when teaching me about wine varietals, back when we were first married, and I still thought his condescension was sophistication. The girl nodded earnestly, as if coffee preparation was the most fascinating subject in the world, and I realized with a sick clarity that this wasn't the first time she'd been in my kitchen, wearing my husband's clothes, learning to use appliances I'd researched and selected. I cleared my throat, and they both turned toward me with expressions that shifted from surprise to horror, faster than I could blink. The girl's hand flew to the hem of the t-shirt, tugging it down as if an extra inch of fabric could undo what I'd just witnessed. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. "Victoria," he said finally, my name coming out strangled. "You're home early." I set my purse down on the counter with deliberate care, the way I'd learned to control my movements during the years when Marcus's criticism could turn my clumsiness into evidence of my inadequacy. "So I am." The girl looked between us with wide eyes, and I could see her calculating whether to run upstairs for her clothes or try to brazen it out. She was pretty in that generic way that young women often are, all smooth skin and shiny hair. But there was something shrewd in her gaze that suggested she wasn't quite as innocent as her giggles implied. "This is Amber," Marcus said, as if introducing his mistress in our kitchen was a normal social situation requiring proper etiquette. "Amber, this is my wife Victoria." Amber gave a little wave that made me want to laugh and scream simultaneously. "Hi, Mrs. Chen. Marcus has told me so much about you." I'm sure he has, I thought, but what I said was, "How nice. And what exactly brings you to my kitchen this morning, Amber?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus stepped slightly in front of her, a protective gesture that told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been going on, and how serious he thought it was. "Victoria, let me explain." He started, but I held up a hand. "No need. I can see the situation quite clearly." I opened the refrigerator and pulled out the orange juice, poured myself a glass with steady hands, and took a sip. "Amber, you should probably get dressed. I imagine you have somewhere to be." She looked at Marcus for direction, which annoyed me more than her presence in my house. At 25, I had been running my own life and making my own decisions. I hadn't been looking to older men for permission to exist. "Maybe you should go," Marcus said quietly, and she nodded, scurrying out of the kitchen with the t-shirt barely covering her thighs. I heard her feet on the stairs, then the sound of our bedroom door closing. Marcus and I stood in silence, listening to drawers opening and closing above us. He poured himself coffee from the machine she'd been learning to use, his hands shaking slightly. When he turned back to face me, he had composed himself into the version of Marcus I knew best, the attorney who specialized in making unreasonable things sound perfectly logical. "This isn't what it looks like," he said. I almost laughed. "It looks like you're having an affair with someone young enough to be our daughter, in our home, while I was visiting my sick sister. What part of that assessment is incorrect?" He set his coffee cup down harder than necessary. "Victoria, our marriage has been stagnant for years. We both know that. We're like roommates who share expenses." It was a line he'd clearly rehearsed, probably in therapy sessions I didn't know he was attending, or in late-night phone calls with Amber while I slept in our bed. The casualness of it, the way he delivered it like a closing argument, made something cold settle in my chest. "Stagnant," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling 23 years of marriage now? When's the last time we had a real conversation? When's the last time you seemed happy to see me come home?" His voice was gaining confidence, building the case for why his infidelity was actually my fault. "You spend more time arranging other people's furniture than you do paying attention to your own husband." I could have argued. I could have reminded him of the dinners I'd planned, the events I'd organized, the way I'd structured my entire life around supporting his career and maintaining the image of success he needed to feel important. I could have pointed out that conversations require two willing participants, and that happiness is hard to sustain when you're constantly being evaluated and found wanting. Instead, I finished my orange juice and rinsed the glass in the sink. "You're right," I said. "I haven't been paying nearly enough attention." He looked surprised, as if he'd expected more of a fight. Amber's heels clicked on the stairs as she descended, now dressed in the kind of outfit that cost more than most people's rent, but was designed to look effortlessly casual. She had good taste, I'd give her that. "I'll call you later," Marcus said to her, and she nodded, avoiding my eyes as she gathered her purse and headed for the front door. The sound of it closing behind her seemed...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
To echo through the house. Marcus turned back to me with something that might have been relief. "Victoria, I think we should talk about this like adults. Maybe we can work something out that makes sense for everyone." "Something that makes sense for everyone," I repeated slowly. "You mean something that lets you keep your wife and your girlfriend without any inconvenient consequences? I mean something that acknowledges we've both been unhappy for a long time. Maybe this is an opportunity to figure out what we actually want." What I wanted in that moment was to throw something heavy at his head. What I wanted was to scream until my throat was raw and my lungs were empty. What I wanted was to rewind 23 years and choose differently, choose better, choose someone who wouldn't stand in our kitchen justifying infidelity like it was a reasonable business decision. But what I said was, "You're absolutely right. We should definitely figure out what we want." I walked past him toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom to look back. He was standing in the kitchen looking pleased with himself, as if he'd just successfully negotiated a difficult contract. "Marcus?" I said. "Yes. Don't bring her back to this house. Whatever arrangement you think we're going to work out, it doesn't include me watching you play house with your girlfriend in my kitchen." He had the grace to look slightly ashamed. Of course. That was inappropriate. Inappropriate. As if the problem was one of etiquette rather than betrayal. I went upstairs to our bedroom, where the sheets were rumpled and there were 2 wine glasses on the nightstand that hadn't been there when I left for Portland. I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for over 2 decades and tried to feel something other than the strange, hollow calm that had settled over me. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't having the breakdown that Marcus probably expected and maybe even hoped for, the kind of emotional display that would justify his actions and make him feel like the reasonable one in this situation. Instead, I was thinking about the last 5 years of our marriage, all the late nights he'd claimed were work, all the business trips that seemed to multiply, all the times he'd criticized my appearance or my interests or my friends, until I'd gradually stopped having opinions about anything that mattered. I was thinking about the prenuptial agreement we'd signed back when Marcus was just starting at the firm, and I was too young and too in love to understand what I was agreeing to. The document that protected his assets and his inheritance but left me with almost nothing if our marriage ended. I was thinking about the interior design business I'd built slowly and carefully, the clients who trusted me, the reputation I'd earned independent of being Marcus Chen's wife. The business that existed entirely in my name, with accounts he'd never paid attention to because he considered my work a hobby rather than a career. I was thinking about a lot of things Marcus didn't know I knew about. That afternoon, while Marcus was presumably at his office or with Amber or wherever men go when they need to process the inconvenience of getting caught, I made a phone call to someone I'd hoped I'd never need to contact professionally. Sandra Martinez had been in my book club 3 years ago, before she'd gotten too busy with her practice to read novels about women discovering their inner strength. She was a divorce attorney who specialized in high net worth cases, particularly ones involving professional men who thought their wives were decorative accessories rather than equal partners. "Victoria," she said when she answered the phone, "this is a pleasant surprise. How are you?" "I've been better," I said. "Sandra, I need to ask you something, and I need you to pretend this is a hypothetical question until I decide whether it's not. Attorney-client privilege begins the moment you ask for legal advice, hypothetical or otherwise." "What's going on?" I told her about walking into the kitchen, about Marcus's explanation of our stagnant marriage, about his suggestion that we work out an arrangement that made sense for everyone. I told her about the prenup and about my business and about the feeling that I'd been sleepwalking through my own life for years. Sandra listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Victoria," she said finally, "how much do you know about Marcus's financial situation? Not the household accounts you manage, but his personal investments, his partnerships, his real assets?" "I know what he tells me. We have separate finances, except for the household expenses." "When's the last time you looked at his tax returns?" "I thought about it. He handles all that through his accountant. I sign where he tells me to sign." "And your business? How is that structured?" "It's an LLC in my name only. He insisted on that years ago. Said it would protect our personal assets if anything went wrong." Sandra was quiet again, and I could almost hear her brain working through possibilities. "Victoria, I want you to listen to me carefully. Don't make any decisions right now. Don't move any money. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to any arrangements, and for God's sake, don't leave the house. Can you do that?" "Yes, but why?" "Because I think your husband may have underestimated exactly who he's been married to for 23 years. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" "Of course." "And Victoria? Bring everything. Tax returns, bank statements, insurance policies, investment accounts, business records, anything financial you can find, even if you think it's not important." "Are you going to tell me what you're thinking?" "Not over the phone. But I will say this. Men like Marcus always make the same mistake. They assume their wives are paying as little attention to the details as they are to their marriages." After I hung up, I sat in my home office surrounded by the careful organization that had made my design business successful. I thought about all the years I'd been quietly managing our household, all the financial documents I'd filed and organized, all the conversations I'd overheard when Marcus thought I wasn't listening, or wasn't smart enough to understand what they meant. I thought about the locked filing cabinet in Marcus's home office, that he thought I'd never noticed him opening. I thought about the key I'd seen him hide behind a picture frame during one of his late-night phone calls. I thought about how many evenings I'd spent alone in this house while he worked late or traveled, and how much curiosity a person can develop when they have unlimited time and access. That evening, Marcus came home with flowers and a bottle of wine, ready to continue the conversation he thought we'd been having about our future arrangements. He found me in the kitchen making dinner, the same kitchen where I'd discovered his girlfriend that morning. "Victoria," he said, setting the flowers on the counter. "I've been thinking about what happened today." "Have you?" I kept stirring the risotto, not looking at him. "I want you to know that I never meant for you to find out that way. You deserved better than that." "Better than walking in on you with another woman in our kitchen? Better than being blindsided. I should have talked to you first." Explained how I've been feeling. I turned to face him, and he seemed surprised by how calm I looked. "How you've been feeling about what, Marcus?" "About us. About our marriage. About the fact that we've been going through the motions for years." "And when exactly did you start feeling this way?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "It's been gradual. I don't think there was a specific moment." "Was it before or after you started sleeping with Amber?" "Victoria, it's a simple question. Did your feelings about our stagnant marriage develop before you began your affair? Or did your affair make you realize our marriage was stagnant?" He poured himself wine from the bottle he'd brought, taking time to think about his answer. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me. I suppose I started feeling disconnected from you before I met Amber. She just made me realize what was missing." "What was missing?" As if a marriage was a recipe where you could substitute ingredients and still end up with the same dish. "And what exactly was missing, Marcus?" "Passion. Excitement. The feeling that someone actually wanted to be with me, instead of just tolerating me." I turned off the heat under the risotto and faced him fully. "When's the last time you tried to create passion or excitement in our marriage?" "What do you mean?" "When's the last time you planned something special for us? When's the last time you asked me about my dreams or my goals or what I wanted to do with my life? When's the last time you looked at me like you were seeing me instead of evaluating me?" He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. "I'll tell you when," I continued. "It was before you decided I was just a supporting character in your life story. Before you started treating me like a household manager who occasionally shared your bed. Before you stopped seeing me as a person with my own thoughts and feelings and started seeing me as someone whose job was to make your life comfortable." "That's not fair, Victoria. I've always supported your career. You've tolerated it. There's a difference." We stared at each other across the kitchen island, 23 years of accumulated resentments and unspoken truths sitting between us like an uninvited guest. "So what do you want to do?" he asked finally. "I want to have dinner. I want to think. I want to figure out what's best for both of us." He looked relieved again, as if my reasonableness confirmed his belief that this could all be worked out to his satisfaction. "I'm glad you're being so mature about this, Victoria. A lot of women would have made this much more difficult. A lot of women." As if my reaction to his infidelity was a personality flaw rather than a choice. We ate dinner in relative quiet, making small talk about his work and mine, like we were acquaintances sharing a meal, rather than spouses navigating the end of their marriage. After Marcus went to bed, claiming exhaustion from the emotional stress of the day, I sat in my office with a cup of tea and a legal pad, making lists. I listed every financial account I knew about, every investment, every piece of property, every business asset that might be relevant to divorce proceedings. I listed every suspicious late night, every unexplained expense, every time Marcus had been evasive about his schedule or his whereabouts. I listed every year I'd subordinated my interests to his, every opportunity I'd passed up to make his life easier, every time I'd made myself smaller so he could feel bigger. Then I went to his office. The key was exactly where I'd seen him put it, behind the picture of us at his law firm's holiday party 5 years ago, back when he still occasionally touched my hand during public events. The filing cabinet opened easily, revealing folders of documents I'd never seen before. Investment accounts with balances that made my design business look like a lemonade stand. Real estate holdings I didn't know existed. Partnership agreements in ventures he'd never mentioned. Tax returns that showed income far beyond what he'd told me he was earning. And in the very back, a folder marked personal that contained emails printed and filed, correspondence with Amber dating back almost 2 years. Not just the passionate declarations I expected, but practical discussions about their future together, about the apartment he'd helped her lease, about the joint investment account they'd opened. I photographed everything with my phone, working by lamplight while Marcus slept upstairs, probably dreaming about his uncomplicated life with his uncomplicated girlfriend. Page after page of evidence that our marriage hadn't become stagnant by accident or through mutual neglect, but because Marcus had systematically checked out while building a separate life. When I finished, I locked the cabinet and returned the key to its hiding place, then sat in his leather chair and looked around the office I'd decorated for him years ago. The shelves of books he never read, the awards from his professional associations, the expensive whiskey he served to clients but never shared with me. Tomorrow I would go to Sandra's office and show her what I'd found. Tomorrow I would begin the process of untangling 23 years of legal and financial partnership with a man who thought he could manage me like he managed everything else in his life. But tonight, I sat in the dark and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger anymore, not hurt, not even satisfaction at my successful reconnaissance mission. I felt free. Free from the exhausting work of trying to be enough for someone who had decided I wasn't. Free from the anxiety of never knowing what mood would greet me when he came home. Free from the constant low-level tension of living with someone who saw my independence as inconvenience and my needs as weakness. I felt like Victoria Chen again, not Marcus's wife or Marcus's problem or Marcus's disappointment, but the woman who had built a successful business and maintained friendships and navigated the world perfectly well before she'd ever met him. The woman who was about to remind him that quiet wives often pay attention to everything. The next morning, Marcus left for work with a kiss on my cheek and a promise that we'd continue our conversation that evening. He seemed pleased with how reasonably I was handling his revelation, how open I was to finding a solution that worked for everyone. I waited until his car disappeared down our driveway, then gathered every document I'd photographed the night before, along with 5 years of tax returns, bank statements, and business records. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the navy Armani that made me feel confident and competent, and drove to Sandra's office in White Plains. Her practice occupied the top floor of a modern building with views of the Hudson River, and her office itself was decorated in soothing blues and grays that probably helped calm her clients' nerves during difficult conversations about the end of their marriages. Sandra was waiting for me with coffee and a legal pad covered in neat handwriting. She was younger than me by about 10 years, with short silver hair and the kind of focused energy that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries when there was work to be done. "Victoria," she said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "Thank you for coming in. How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," I said, settling into the chair with my folder of documents. "I think I'm more angry about the lies than about the affair itself. That's actually very normal. Infidelity is one thing, but financial deception in a marriage can feel like a deeper betrayal." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what you found." I walked her through everything, showing her the bank statements and investment records, the real estate holdings I'd never known about, the correspondence between Marcus and Amber that revealed the extent of their relationship and their future plans. Sandra took notes as I talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting specific documents. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied her notes for several minutes. "Victoria," she said finally, "your husband has made several significant mistakes. Other than bringing his girlfriend home? Much bigger than that. First, by keeping these assets secret during your marriage, he's violated his fiduciary duty to you as his spouse. In New York, that's grounds for an unequal distribution of marital property. What does that mean in practical terms? It means the prenup he's counting on to protect him becomes much less relevant when he's been hiding assets and income. Courts don't look kindly on financial deception, especially when it's been systematic over multiple years." She turned to a fresh page in her legal pad. "Second, by using marital funds to support his affair, including helping Amber with her apartment and their joint investments, he's essentially gifted community property to his mistress. We can demand that he recover those funds or account for them in the settlement." I felt a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "And third, your business. Because it's structured as a separate entity and you've been careful to keep it independent, It's not marital property subject to division. But the income you've generated, especially over the last several years, might be significant enough to affect spousal support calculations. Meaning? Meaning, you may not need as much from him as he thinks you do. And depending on how the court views his deception and misconduct, you may be entitled to much more than he thinks he'll have to give. Sandra closed her legal pad and looked at me directly. Victoria, I have to ask, what do you want out of this? Do you want to save your marriage? Or do you want out? It was a question I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. For 23 years, my identity had been so wrapped up in being Marcus's wife that imagining life without that role felt like imagining life without gravity. I want out, I said, and saying it aloud made it real in a way that surprised me. I want out, with enough resources to build whatever comes next, without having to ask his permission or his opinion. Then we need to be strategic. New York allows for no-fault divorce, but given the circumstances, I recommend we file on fault-based grounds. Adultery, specifically. It gives us more leverage in negotiations. What happens next? Next, you go home and act normal. Don't let him know you've seen an attorney. Don't change your behavior, don't move money, don't do anything that suggests you're planning something. Can you do that? Yes. Good. I'm going to have my investigator do some additional research on his assets and his relationship with Amber. I want a complete financial picture before we make any moves. That could take a few weeks. And then? Sandra smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. And then we introduce your husband to the concept of consequences. I drove home through the autumn afternoon, feeling lighter than I had in years. The trees along our street were turning brilliant oranges and reds, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed their beauty instead of worrying about leaf cleanup and gutter maintenance. Marcus was already home when I arrived, standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine and his phone pressed to his ear. He was laughing at something the person on the other end had said, and I wondered if it was Amber, if they were sharing jokes about his reasonable wife and their mature arrangement. He ended the call when he saw me and smiled in that way that had once made my heart race but now just looked practiced. "How was your day?" he asked. "Productive," I said, hanging my purse on its designated hook. "I had lunch with Sandra Martinez. Do you remember her? She was in my book club a few years ago. The name sounds familiar. What's she up to these days?" "She's a lawyer now. Divorce work, mostly." Marcus's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his wine glass. "That's nice. Did you have a good time catching up?" "Very good. She's got some interesting stories about her cases. Apparently she sees a lot of men who think they can have their cake and eat it too, if you know what I mean." "I'm not sure I follow." I opened the refrigerator and began pulling out ingredients for dinner, keeping my tone conversational. "Oh, you know, men who want to stay married for the financial benefits and social status but also want the excitement of a girlfriend on the side. Sandra says they're usually shocked when their wives don't find the arrangement as reasonable as they do." Marcus was very still behind me. "That's an interesting perspective. She says the smart wives are the ones who don't react emotionally right away. They take their time, do their research, make sure they understand exactly what they're dealing with before they make any decisions. And what do they usually find when they do their research?" I turned to face him, knife in hand from cutting vegetables. "Usually, that their husbands have been hiding a lot more than just affairs. Money, property, future, plans." Sandra says financial infidelity almost always goes hand in hand with sexual infidelity. The color had drained from Marcus's face, but he was trying to maintain his composure. That sounds like a cynical way to view marriage. Or realistic, depending on your perspective. I went back to chopping. She told me the most amazing story today about a client whose husband had been hiding investment accounts and real estate holdings for years. Can you imagine? The wife had no idea they were worth millions more than she thought. What happened? Oh, the usual. Turns out hiding marital assets is illegal, so the court awarded her a much larger share of the settlement than the prenup would have normally allowed. Plus damages for the financial deception. Plus attorney fees. Marcus set his wine glass down with a slightly shaky hand. "Victoria, why are you telling me this?" I looked up from the cutting board and smiled. No particular reason, just interesting conversation. Sandra's cases are like soap operas, really. All these people thinking they're so smart, not realizing that someone else is paying attention to every detail. We stared at each other across the kitchen island, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much I was just making conversation. The same kitchen where I'd found him with Amber, where he'd explained our stagnant marriage, where he'd asked me to work out an arrangement that made sense for everyone. "Victoria," he said carefully, "I hope you know that you can talk to me about anything. If you have concerns or questions about our situation, I want us to be able to discuss them openly." "Of course," I said. "I've always believed honesty is the foundation of any good relationship." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. That night, Marcus stayed up late in his office and I could hear him on the phone making hushed calls. I wondered if he was talking to Amber, to his attorney, to his financial advisor, trying to figure out how much trouble he might be in and what his options were. I lay in our bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman I'd been when I married him. 28 years old, successful in my own right, confident and independent until I'd gradually allowed those qualities to be worn away by years of criticism and control disguised as concern and guidance. Tomorrow, Sandra would begin the process of formally documenting Marcus's hidden assets and his systematic deception. Within weeks, we'd have enough evidence to file for divorce on grounds that would give me significant leverage in negotiations. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The satisfaction of being underestimated by someone who should have known better. Marcus had spent so many years treating me like a beautiful accessory that he'd forgotten I had a brain of my own, forgotten that I'd been managing complex projects and difficult clients long before I'd met him. He'd forgotten that the quiet wife who organized his life and managed his household might also be paying attention to everything else he thought he was hiding. In the morning, I would continue to play the role of the reasonable wife considering her options. But in a few weeks, Marcus Chen was going to discover exactly what kind of woman he'd been married to for 23 years. And I was going to enjoy every minute of watching him find out. 3 weeks passed in a strange dance of normalcy that felt like performing in a play where only I knew the real script. Marcus continued his routine of coffee and newspaper in the morning, late nights at the office, weekend phone calls he claimed were work-related but took in private. I continued mine of managing our household, meeting with clients, preparing meals he barely tasted while scrolling through his phone. The difference was that now I knew exactly what I was watching. Every hushed conversation, every unexplained absence, every time he claimed to be working late while his location showed him at restaurants I'd never been to. Sandra's investigator had provided me with a detailed report that read like a manual for how to systematically betray your spouse while maintaining plausible deniability. Amber wasn't Marcus's first affair, just his most serious one. There had been others over the years, brief encounters with associates and clients that he'd managed to keep discreet. But with Amber, he'd made the mistake of falling in love, or at least falling in love with the idea of himself as a man who could capture the attention of someone half his age. The financial deception ran even deeper than I'd initially discovered. Marcus had been skimming money from our joint accounts for years, moving it into investments and properties held under corporate entities I'd never heard of. The apartment he'd helped Amber secure was actually owned by one of his shell companies, purchased with funds that legally belonged to both of us. More damaging still were the emails Sandra's team had recovered from his deleted files. Not just romantic correspondence, but detailed discussions about his post-divorce financial planning, conversations about how much he expected to pay in alimony and how to minimize his exposure. He'd been planning to leave me for months, possibly years, while I'd been planning dinner parties and anniversary celebrations. The most telling document was a consultation summary from his own divorce attorney, dated 6 months before I'd walked into that kitchen. Marcus had been researching his options, exploring how the prenup would protect him, calculating what it would cost to end our marriage, all while coming home every night and asking about my day, kissing me goodbye every morning, maintaining the fiction that we were working toward the same future. Sandra called me on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was reviewing fabric samples for a client's penthouse renovation. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "Victoria, we need to meet. Can you come in this afternoon? Is everything all right? Everything is perfect. We've got him. I rearranged my schedule and drove to her office through heavy traffic that couldn't slow the anticipation building in my chest. Sandra was waiting with a thick folder and the same focused energy I'd come to associate with good news delivered in professional settings. Your husband has been very busy, she said without preamble, spreading documents across her conference table. And very sloppy. The papers told a story of systematic financial manipulation that was breathtaking in its scope and stupidity. Marcus had used joint credit cards to fund his affair, charged romantic dinners and weekend getaways to accounts I was legally responsible for. He'd taken cash advances against our home equity line of credit to invest in speculative ventures that existed primarily to hide assets from potential divorce proceedings. Most damaging of all, he'd forged my signature on loan documents, using our house as collateral for investments I'd never agreed to. Not only was this illegal, but it put our home at risk if his ventures failed, which several of them had. He's exposed himself to criminal liability, Sandra explained, her finger tracing the forged signatures that looked nothing like my actual handwriting. But more importantly for our purposes, he's violated the terms of your prenup. How so? The prenup assumes good faith financial disclosure between spouses. By hiding assets and forging your signature, he's breached that agreement. A court can throw out the entire document. Sandra pulled out a calculator and began running numbers that made my head spin. Without the prenup's protections, I was entitled to half of everything Marcus had earned during our marriage, including the assets he'd tried to hide. With the financial misconduct factored in, I could potentially claim damages that would leave him significantly worse off than if he'd simply asked for a divorce honestly. There's more, she said, turning to a fresh page of notes. Amber isn't just his girlfriend, she's also his business partner. What do you mean? 3 of the investment entities he's been using to hide assets list her as a minority owner. She's not just sleeping with your husband, she's helping him commit financial fraud. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Can we prove that? We already have. Corporate filings, bank records, email correspondence discussing their business relationship alongside their personal one. She's in this up to her neck. Sandra leaned back in her chair and studied my face. Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. How far are you willing to take this? What do you mean? I mean, we can destroy him. Professionally, financially, personally. The evidence we have could result in criminal charges, disbarment proceedings, civil judgments that would follow him for the rest of his life. But once we pull that trigger, there's no going back to quiet negotiations and amicable settlements. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 weeks ago, standing in my kitchen watching my husband teach his mistress to use our coffee machine. I thought about all the years I'd made myself smaller to accommodate his ego, all the dreams I'd deferred to support his ambitions, all the times I'd accepted his criticism and control as the price of being married to a successful man. I thought about the emails discussing how to minimize what he'd owe me in a divorce, written while he was still sharing my bed and accepting my care. I want to destroy him, I said, and saying it felt like taking my first real breath in years. Sandra smiled. Then let's get started. The plan she outlined was elegant in its thoroughness. We would file for divorce on fault-based grounds, citing adultery and financial misconduct. Simultaneously, we would pursue civil claims for the fraudulent use of marital assets and seek criminal referrals for the forged documents. We would demand full financial disclosure and freeze his accounts to prevent further asset hiding. Most satisfying of all, we would serve papers at his office, in front of his colleagues and partners, ensuring that his professional reputation would be damaged before he had a chance to control the narrative. When? I asked. Friday afternoon, right before the weekend, so he has 2 days to sit with it before he can start making phone calls and scheduling meetings. And Amber? She'll be served simultaneously. Civil suit for conversion of marital assets, conspiracy to defraud, and intentional interference with marriage. She wanted to play grown-up games, so we'll treat her like a grown-up. I left Sandra's office feeling like I was walking on air. The autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, and I drove home through familiar streets that looked different now, brighter somehow, as if someone had adjusted the contrast on the world. Marcus was already home when I arrived, standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine, and that false smile I'd learned to recognize as his guilty conscience putting on a performance. "How was your day?" he asked, the same question he'd asked every day for 23 years. "Wonderful," I said, and meant it for the first time in months. "I had lunch with Sandra again. You'd really like her, Marcus. She's very thorough." His smile flickered. "You seem to be spending a lot of time with her lately." "She's good company. Very smart, very strategic. She's taught me a lot about paying attention to details." I hung my purse on its hook and began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator, humming softly to myself. Marcus watched me with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Victoria, is everything all right? You seem different lately." "Different how?" "I don't know. Happier, maybe? More confident?" I turned to face him, knife in hand from chopping vegetables. "I think I'm finally figuring some things out." "What kind of things?" "Oh, you know. Life things. What I want, what I deserve, what I'm willing to accept." I went back to chopping. Sandra says women often don't realize their own power until they're forced to use it. Marcus set his wine glass down with the careful precision of someone trying not to show nervousness. "That's an interesting observation." She has a lot of interesting observations, like how men often underestimate their wives because they confuse quiet with stupid. "I've never thought you were stupid, Victoria." "Haven't you?" I looked up from the cutting board. "You've certainly acted like it. All those late nights at the office that weren't at the office. All those business trips with expenses that don't match your stories. All those phone calls you take in private like I couldn't possibly understand complex conversations." The kitchen went very quiet except for the sound of my knife hitting the cutting board in steady rhythm. "Victoria, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been paying attention, Marcus, to everything. And I'm saying that sometimes the quiet wife knows a lot more than the cheating husband gives her credit for." Marcus's face had gone pale. "Are you threatening me?" "Threatening you? Of course not. I'm just making conversation, the way married people do when they're honest with each other." I continued preparing dinner while he stood frozen behind me, probably running through every conversation we'd had over the past few weeks, trying to figure out how much I knew and how long I'd known it. "Victoria, I think we need to talk." "We are talking. I mean really talk. About us, about our future, about what we both want." I turned around and leaned against the counter, giving him my full attention. "All right. What do you want, Marcus?" "I want us to be happy." "Both of us? Or just you?" "Both of us. I want us to find a way to be happy together." "Together? What about Amber?" His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "What about her?" "Well, I assume she factors into your happiness somehow, since you've been building a life with her for the past 2 years. Victoria, You've been planning to leave me for months, Marcus. You've been moving our money into accounts I can't access, buying property in her name, setting up investments that benefit both of you at my expense. So when you say you want us to be happy together, I'm curious what that means exactly." Marcus sank into one of the kitchen chairs like his legs could no longer support him. "How do you know all that?" "I told you, I've been paying attention." "For how long?" "Long enough." He put his head in his hands. "Victoria, I can explain everything." "I'm sure you can. You're a lawyer. Explaining things is what you do for a living, but I'm not interested in explanations anymore." "Then what are you interested in?" I smiled, feeling truly happy for the first time in years. "Justice." Marcus looked up at me with something that might have been fear. "What does that mean?" "It means you're about to find out what happens when the quiet wife stops being quiet." The next 2 days passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. Marcus tried repeatedly to engage me in conversations about our relationship, our future, what I wanted from him. But I had nothing more to say. I'd spent 23 years talking to him, explaining my feelings, asking for his attention, begging for his respect. Now it was time to let my actions speak for themselves. He called in sick to work on Thursday, spending the day following me around the house like a nervous dog, trying to gauge my mood and intentions. I went about my normal routine, meeting with clients, running errands, preparing for the weekend as if nothing had changed. Thursday evening, he tried a different approach, pulling out photo albums from our early years together, reminiscing about trips we'd taken and milestones we'd celebrated. He talked about how young we'd been, how much we'd both grown, how maybe we could find our way back to what we'd once had. I listened politely while reviewing fabric samples for a project due the following week. "Do you remember our honeymoon in Tuscany?" he asked, pointing to a photo of us at a vineyard, both of us tan and smiling. "You said it was the happiest you'd ever been." "I remember. We could go back. Take a second honeymoon, start over fresh." "With Amber?" "Victoria, please. I've ended things with Amber. It's over." I looked up from my fabric samples. "When?" "Yesterday. I called her yesterday and told her we couldn't see each other anymore." "And what did she say?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "She was upset, of course, but she understood." "Did she understand that you'd been lying to her about your assets? Did she understand that the apartment you bought her was purchased with money that belonged to both of us? Did she understand that the investment accounts you opened together were funded with fraudulent loans?" Marcus stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "How could you possibly know about any of that?" "I told you, Marcus. I've been paying attention." Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matches momentous occasions in movies. Marcus left for work with obvious reluctance, looking back at me as if he might never see me again. "Victoria," he said from the doorway, "whatever you're planning, we can work this out. We don't need lawyers or courts or any of that ugliness. We can handle this between ourselves like adults." "Like adults," I repeated. "The way you handled your affair? The way you handled hiding our assets? The way you handled forging my signature on loan documents? You keep saying that, but I never forged." I walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out copies of the documents Sandra had given me, spreading them on the counter between us. Marcus's face went white as he recognized his handiwork. "These are my signatures, Marcus. The ones on the loan applications for the ventures you and Amber invested in together." "Victoria, I can explain." "I know you can. You'll have plenty of opportunity to explain everything. To the court, to your partners, to the State Bar Association." "The State Bar?" "Forgery is a felony, Marcus. Lawyers who commit felonies tend to have problems with their professional licenses." He stood in the doorway for a long moment, rain beginning to spatter against the windows behind him. "You're really going to do this? I'm really going to do this. After 23 years, you're going to destroy me over a mistake. 23 years of mistakes, Marcus. 23 years of lies and manipulation and treating me like an inconvenient accessory to your life. This isn't about one affair or even one forged signature. This is about the man you've been all along, and the woman I've finally remembered I am." He left without another word, and I watched his car disappear down our driveway for what I knew would be the last time. Then I made myself a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, and waited for Sandra to call with confirmation that the papers had been served. The call came at 2:47 p.m. "It's done," Sandra said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Both locations, simultaneously. Your husband was in a partners meeting when the process server arrived. According to my contact, he went very pale and excused himself immediately. And Amber? Served at her apartment. Apparently she started crying and asking if this was really happening. What happens next? Now we wait for them to respond. Marcus has 30 days to file an answer to the divorce petition, but given the criminal referrals we're making, I expect to hear from his attorney much sooner than that." "Criminal referrals?" "For the forged documents, I've already been in touch with the district attorney's office. They're very interested in prosecuting financial crimes against spouses." I hung up and sat in the quiet house, listening to the rain against the windows, and the familiar sounds of a home that would soon belong entirely to me. The refrigerator humming, the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time, the old radiators beginning their evening warmth. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility. Marcus came home at 6:30, earlier than usual, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a single afternoon. He found me in the living room reading a book, curled up in the chair by the window with a cup of tea and a blanket across my lap. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Do we?" "Victoria, this is insane. You can't be serious about pressing criminal charges." I looked up from my book. "Why can't I be serious about it?" "Because it's vindictive and destructive and completely out of proportion to what happened." "What happened, Marcus? Tell me what you think happened." "I made some mistakes, I acted badly, I hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But destroying my career and putting me in jail isn't going to fix anything." I closed my book and set it on the side table. "You're right, it won't fix anything. But it might prevent you from doing the same thing to the next woman." "There won't be a next woman. I told you I've ended things with Amber." "Because you got caught, not because you developed a conscience." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, the gesture making him look younger and more vulnerable than he had in years. "Victoria, please. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I'm asking for a chance to make this right." "How?" "However you want. Counseling, therapy, a trial separation while we work things out. I'll do whatever it takes." "Will you go to prison?" "What?" "You asked what it would take to make this right. Will you plead guilty to fraud and forgery and go to prison?" "That's not reasonable, Victoria. Isn't it? You committed crimes against me, Marcus. You stole from me, you lied to me, you betrayed me in every way possible. Why isn't prison a reasonable consequence for criminal behavior?" "Because it would destroy everything we've built together." I stood up and faced him across the living room we'd decorated together, in the house we'd shared for over 2 decades. "You already destroyed everything we built together. You destroyed it the first time you decided I was someone you could lie to and steal from and cheat on. You destroyed it when you started planning your exit strategy while still pretending to love me. All I'm doing now is acknowledging that it's already gone." Marcus slumped into the couch, his head in his hands. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "Yes, you did. You meant for all of it to happen, you just didn't mean to get caught." "That's not true, isn't it? You meant to have an affair. You meant to hide assets from me. You meant to forge my signature when it suited your purposes. You meant to plan a future that didn't include me while still expecting me to cook your dinner and wash your clothes and play the devoted wife for your colleagues and friends." I walked over to where he sat and looked down at him, this man I'd once loved enough to build a life with. "The only thing you didn't mean to do was get caught by someone smart enough to fight back." Marcus looked up at me with something that might have been genuine surprise. "When did you become so hard? When did you become so weak?" We stared at each other across the gulf that had opened between us, 23 years of marriage collapsing into this moment of perfect clarity. "Victoria," he said finally, "what do you want from me?" "I want you to leave this house tonight and never come back. I want you to liquidate every asset you've hidden and transfer half to me immediately. I want you to plead guilty to the criminal charges and accept whatever consequences follow. And if I do all that, then maybe I'll consider not pursuing civil damages for emotional distress and punitive compensation. And if I don't?" I smiled, and for the first time in our marriage I saw him look at me with something approaching respect. "Then you'll find out exactly how thorough Sandra Martinez can be when she sets her mind to destroying someone." Marcus left that night with a suitcase and a look of stunned disbelief, as if he still couldn't quite process that the quiet wife who'd organized his life for 23 years had just dismantled it with surgical precision. I locked the door behind him and walked through the house that was finally, completely mine. Every room held memories of the life we'd shared, but somehow they no longer felt like anchors dragging me down. They felt like proof that I'd survived something that should have destroyed me and come out stronger on the other side. I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle Marcus had brought home 3 weeks ago, when he still thought this could all be managed and controlled to his satisfaction. I sat in my kitchen, in the chair where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for over 2 decades, and raised a toast to the woman I'd forgotten I was capable of being. Outside, rain continued to fall against the windows, washing the world clean for whatever came next. The silence in the house felt different after Marcus left. Not empty or lonely, but clean somehow, like the air after a thunderstorm has cleared away the oppressive humidity that made it hard to breathe. I walked from room to room, seeing everything with new eyes. The expensive furniture we'd chosen together, the artwork from galleries in Manhattan, the carefully curated life that had felt like a museum exhibition of successful marriage. Now it just felt like my home. The first week was a strange adjustment. No one to cook for except myself, no schedule to accommodate except my own, no mood to read and navigate around. I found myself making decisions without consultation for the first time in decades. I wanted coffee at 10 in the evening, so I made coffee. I wanted to rearrange the living room furniture, so I spent Saturday morning pushing the sofa to a different wall just because I could. Sandra called regularly with updates on Marcus's increasingly desperate attempts to minimize the legal consequences of his actions. His attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Vale, who specialized in defending white-collar criminals, had reached out within 48 hours of the papers being served. They want to negotiate, Sandra told me during one of our phone calls. Patricia is suggesting a settlement conference where we can discuss terms without going through lengthy court proceedings. What kind of terms? Marcus would agree to an unequal division of assets in your favor, plus substantial alimony, in exchange for you dropping the criminal referrals and agreeing not to pursue civil damages. I was sitting in my office, looking out at the garden I'd neglected for years because Marcus preferred to hire landscapers rather than let me dig in the dirt like some common suburbanite. What do you recommend? Honestly, I think we should hear what they're offering. Not because I want to settle, but because I want to know how scared they are. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following Thursday at Patricia Vale's office in Manhattan. I chose my outfit carefully, the same way I'd learned to dress for client meetings where I needed to project confidence and competence. A tailored black suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, shoes that clicked with authority on hard floors, jewelry that suggested success without ostentation. Marcus was already seated at the conference table when Sandra and I arrived, looking like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't hide. Next to him sat Patricia Vale, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that suggested she'd been intimidating opponents in courtrooms since before I was born. Across from them sat another woman I didn't recognize, introduced as Victoria Chen, Marcus's financial advisor, the woman who'd presumably helped him hide assets and structure the fraudulent investments that had gotten him into this mess. "Victoria," Marcus said as I took my seat, "you look well." "Thank you." Patricia took control of the meeting immediately, spreading documents across the conference table with the efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. "Mrs. Chen, my client acknowledges that mistakes were made in your marriage. He's prepared to offer a generous settlement that would leave you financially secure while allowing both parties to move forward with dignity." "I'm listening," I said. The offer was impressive by most standards. 70% of all marital assets, including the house, plus alimony of $15,000 per month for 10 years. In exchange, I would agree to divorce on no-fault grounds, sign a non-disclosure agreement about the circumstances of our separation, and request that the district attorney drop their investigation into the forged documents. "It's a substantial offer," Patricia continued, "much more generous than any court would likely award, even given the circumstances." Sandra reviewed the documents while I studied Marcus's face. He looked hopeful for the first time since this all began, as if he still believed that money could solve the problem he'd created. "There's one issue," Sandra said finally. "The asset division assumes we're only dealing with the marital property that's been disclosed. But our investigation suggests there are additional holdings that haven't been included in this calculation." Patricia's expression didn't change. "I'm not sure what you mean." Sandra pulled out her own folder and began spreading documents across the table. Bank statements, corporate filings, property records, investment accounts that painted a picture of wealth far beyond what Marcus had ever admitted to owning. For instance, there's the commercial real estate portfolio held by Chen Holdings LLC. 3 properties in Manhattan worth approximately $12 million. Marcus shifted in his chair. Victoria Chen began taking notes with quick, nervous strokes. "There's also the investment account at Goldman Sachs with a current balance of $2.3 million, and the cryptocurrency holdings that were purchased using funds from the home equity line of credit. Patricia looked at Marcus with the expression of a lawyer who just realized her client had lied to her. "Marcus, we discussed full disclosure. You assured me that the financial statements you provided were complete." "They are complete," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sandra smiled in a way that reminded me why I'd chosen her to represent me. "Mrs. Vale, your client has been systematically hiding assets for years. The portfolio I'm showing you represents approximately $8 million in undisclosed wealth, all of it acquired during the marriage using marital funds." The room went very quiet. Patricia studied the documents Sandra had provided, her expression growing darker with each page. "Additionally," Sandra continued, "we have evidence that Mr. Chen used forged signatures to secure loans against undisclosed properties, used joint credit cards to fund personal investments, and transferred marital assets to accounts controlled by his romantic partner." She placed the final document on the table with a flourish. "Which brings us to Miss Amber Richardson, who is also facing civil and criminal liability for her role in these activities." Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. Amber didn't know anything about the financial arrangements. According to her own emails, she knew quite a bit about them, enough to be considered a co-conspirator in multiple felonies. Patricia held up a hand. "Let's take a break. I need to speak with my client privately." Sandra and I retreated to the building's coffee shop while Marcus presumably got the lecture of his life from his attorney. I ordered a latte and found a table by the window, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk below. "How do you feel?" Sandra asked. "Satisfied," I said, and realized I meant it. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I should be doing. Even if this destroys him completely? I thought about the question seriously. 23 years of marriage deserved that much consideration, even if most of those years had been built on lies. "Marcus destroyed himself," I said finally. "I'm just refusing to go down with him." When we returned to the conference room an hour later, the atmosphere had changed completely. Marcus looked defeated. Patricia looked professional but resigned, and Rebecca Chen looked like she was calculating her own legal exposure. "Mrs. Chen," Patricia said, "my client would like to revise his offer." The new proposal was dramatically different. A complete transfer of all marital assets to me, including the previously hidden investments and properties. No alimony, since I would be receiving enough capital to support myself indefinitely. Marcus would keep only his personal possessions and his earning capacity going forward. In exchange, I would agree to request that criminal charges be reduced to misdemeanors with minimal jail time, and I would not pursue civil damages against either Marcus or Amber. "It's essentially everything," Patricia said. My client would be starting over with nothing except his ability to practice law, assuming the state bar doesn't pursue disciplinary action. I looked at Marcus across the table. He wouldn't meet my eyes, staring instead at his hands folded in front of him like a schoolboy waiting for punishment. "I need time to consider this," I said. "Of course." "How long do you need?" "A week." That week was the strangest of my life. I had effectively won everything I could have hoped for when this began, but victory felt more complicated than I'd expected. I found myself thinking not just about the money and property, but about what kind of person I wanted to be when this was all over. I drove to Connecticut to visit my sister Claire, who'd been following the situation with a mixture of horror and admiration. "You realize you're about to become one of the wealthiest divorced women in Westchester County," she said as we sat on her back porch drinking wine and watching her kids play in the yard. "I realize that. And Marcus will be essentially destitute. By his own choices." "I'm not criticizing," Claire said quickly. "God knows he deserves whatever he gets. I'm just wondering how you feel about it." I watched my nephew chase a soccer ball across the lawn, his laughter carrying on the autumn air. I feel like I'm finally myself again. For the first time in 20 years, I'm making decisions based on what's right for me, not what's convenient for someone else. "And what's right for you is taking everything?" What's right for me is not accepting less than I deserve because it makes other people more comfortable. Claire nodded slowly. Mom would be proud of you. Our mother had died 5 years earlier, but I knew what she would have said about this situation. She'd been a teacher for 40 years, raised 4 children after our father left, never remarried because she said she'd learned to like her own company too much to compromise again. A woman has to know her own worth. She used to tell us. Because if she doesn't, everyone else will decide for her. I called Sandra the next morning and told her I was accepting the revised offer, with one addition. I want a public apology, I said. What kind of apology? I want Marcus to write a letter acknowledging what he did, taking full responsibility without making excuses, and explaining how his actions affected me. I want him to read it aloud at the final divorce hearing. Victoria, that's going to be humiliating for him. Good. Sandra was quiet for a moment. You know, this will probably end up in the local papers. Divorce proceedings involving financial fraud tend to attract media attention. I'm counting on it. The letter Marcus wrote was 3 pages long and more honest than anything he'd said to me in years. He acknowledged the affairs, the financial deception, the systematic way he'd undermined our marriage, while pretending to be committed to it. He admitted that he'd treated me like an employee rather than a partner, that he'd taken my loyalty for granted while planning to discard me when it became inconvenient. Most importantly, he acknowledged that none of his behavior was my fault, that I'd been a devoted wife who deserved much better than what he'd given me. The divorce hearing was held on a cold December morning in the Westchester County courthouse. I wore a navy blue dress that I'd bought specifically for the occasion, something that suggested dignity and strength without being flashy or vindictive. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Word had gotten out about the case, and there were reporters in the back rows along with curious attorneys and a few people I recognized from our old social circle. I saw several of Marcus's law firm partners in attendance, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to disgusted. Judge Caroline Stevens was a woman in her 50s, who'd clearly seen every variation of marital misconduct during her years on the bench. She reviewed our settlement agreement with the thoroughness of someone who wanted to make sure both parties understood exactly what they were agreeing to. Mr. Chen, she said finally, you understand that you're transferring essentially all marital assets to your wife, including properties and investments valued at approximately $23 million? Yes, Your Honor. And you understand that this settlement is contingent upon your full cooperation with the criminal investigation and your agreement to make a public statement taking responsibility for your actions? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Stevens looked at me. Mrs. Chen, you understand that accepting this settlement means you're waiving your right to pursue additional civil damages against your husband or his associates? I understand, Your Honor. Very well. Mr. Chen, please read your statement to the court. Marcus stood at the plaintiff's table, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded the pages. His voice was barely above a whisper as he began to read, but Judge Stevens instructed him to speak up so that everyone in the courtroom could hear. The statement was devastating in its honesty. Marcus acknowledged that he'd committed fraud, adultery, and emotional abuse. He admitted that he'd systematically deceived me about our finances while planning to leave me with as little as possible. He took full responsibility for destroying our marriage and causing me years of pain and humiliation. Most powerfully, he acknowledged that I'd been a loving, supportive wife who'd sacrificed her own ambitions to support his career, and that his treatment of me had been inexcusable. When he finished reading, the courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, as if she needed a moment to process what she'd just transcribed. Judge Stevens looked at both of us for a long moment before speaking. In 22 years on this bench, I've seen many examples of marital misconduct, but few as systematic and calculating as what's been described here today. Mr. Chen, you're fortunate that your wife is willing to accept this settlement rather than pursuing the full extent of civil damages available to her. She turned to me. Mrs. Chen, I hope you find peace and happiness in your new circumstances. You've shown remarkable grace throughout these proceedings. The judge signed the final decree, and just like that, 23 years of marriage were officially over. Outside the courthouse, reporters approached me with questions about my plans, my feelings, my advice for other women in similar situations. I answered briefly and politely, saying only that I was looking forward to the next chapter of my life. Marcus left through a side entrance, presumably to avoid the media attention. I didn't try to speak with him, and he didn't try to speak with me. There was nothing left to say between us. Sandra drove me home through the winter afternoon, past familiar streets that looked different now that I owned them in a way I never had before. Not just the house at the end of our driveway, but the future that stretched out ahead of me. "Any regrets?" she asked as we pulled into my driveway. "None," I said, and meant it completely. The first month of my new life was spent making practical decisions about money and property. I sold the Manhattan properties Marcus had hidden, keeping only the house where I'd lived for over 20 years. I moved the investment accounts to a wealth management firm that specialized in working with divorced women, ensuring that I'd never again be in the position of not understanding my own financial situation. I also made some changes to the house itself. I hired the landscaping company to remove the formal gardens Marcus had insisted on and replace them with vegetable plots and wildflower beds. I converted his home office into a proper studio for my design work, with better lighting and storage for fabric samples and project materials. Most importantly, I changed the locks and the security codes, ensuring that this space was completely mine, in every sense that mattered. The criminal case against Marcus was resolved with a plea bargain that resulted in 6 months of house arrest, 5 years of probation, and substantial fines. His law firm quietly asked him to resign, and the state bar suspended his license for 2 years pending completion of his sentence and ethics training. Amber Richardson was charged as an accessory to fraud and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a suspended sentence and community service. She was also required to repay the money that had been spent on her apartment and other expenses, funds that were returned to me as part of the restitution order. The media coverage was exactly what I'd hoped for. Local newspapers and legal blogs covered the case as an example of financial fraud in marriage, highlighting the importance of both spouses being informed about family finances and the legal consequences of hiding assets from a spouse. Several women contacted me through Sandra's office, saying that my case had inspired them to investigate their own marriages and, in some cases, discover similar patterns of deception. A few of them became clients, and Sandra started referring other cases to me when wives needed help understanding complex financial arrangements. I began volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped women navigate divorce proceedings, using my experience to educate others about the warning signs of financial abuse and the importance of understanding your legal rights. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was working in my garden when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked up to see a woman in her 30s getting out of a small sedan, looking nervous and determined in equal measure. "Mrs. Chen?" she called out. "I'm sorry to bother you at home. I'm Jennifer Walsh. I got your name from Sandra Martinez's office." I invited Jennifer inside for coffee, and she told me a story that was depressingly familiar. A husband who handled all the finances, who had started working late and traveling more frequently, who had become critical and distant. She'd found suspicious charges on their credit card statements and emails that suggested he was planning something she wasn't included in. "I keep thinking maybe I'm being paranoid," she said. "Maybe I'm imagining things that aren't there." "Trust your instincts," I told her. "Women usually know when something is wrong long before they have proof." I spent 2 hours with Jennifer that afternoon, helping her understand what documents she should be looking for, what questions she should be asking, what steps she should take to protect herself if her suspicions proved correct. I gave her Sandra's direct phone number and the name of a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud. 3 weeks later, Sandra called to tell me that Jennifer had hired her to represent her in divorce proceedings against a husband who'd been hiding assets and planning to leave her for his business partner. "She says you saved her from losing everything," Sandra told me. "She saved herself. I just gave her permission to pay attention to what she already knew." That conversation became the foundation for what I started thinking of as my new career. Not interior design, though I continued taking select clients, but something that felt more important. I began speaking at women's groups and professional organizations about financial literacy in marriage, about recognizing the signs of financial abuse, about the importance of women maintaining their own economic independence. I wrote articles for magazines and legal journals, sharing my story and offering practical advice for women who found themselves in similar situations. I consulted with attorneys who were representing clients in complex divorce cases, helping them understand the psychology of financial deception and how to uncover hidden assets. Most rewarding of all, I started a foundation that provided financial assistance to women who needed legal representation in divorce cases but couldn't afford attorneys like Sandra. The foundation was funded by a portion of the settlement I'd received from Marcus, money that felt like justice being transformed into hope for other women. A year after my divorce was finalized, I was featured on the cover of a women's magazine with the headline, "The Quiet Wife Who Fought Back." The article detailed my story and the work I was doing to help other women, presenting me as an example of resilience and reinvention. I framed the magazine cover and hung it in my office, not because I was proud of the attention, but because it represented something I'd never expected to become. A woman who'd found her voice by refusing to stay silent, who'd discovered her strength by using it, who'd learned to value herself by demanding that others do the same. Marcus sent me a card on the anniversary of our divorce. Inside, he'd written a brief note saying that he hoped I was happy and that he understood why I'd done what I'd done. He didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest that we might someday be friends. He just acknowledged that I'd been right to refuse to accept less than I deserved. I threw the card away without responding. There was nothing I needed to say to him, nothing I needed from him, nothing about our shared past that required my ongoing attention. He'd been a chapter in my life, not the whole story, and that chapter was closed. Instead, I spent that anniversary evening having dinner with Claire and her family, celebrating not the end of my marriage but the beginning of everything that had come after. My niece, now 14, peppered me with questions about my work and my travels, my plans for the future, and my advice for young women who wanted to be independent. The most important thing, I told her, is to never let anyone convince you that you're worth less than you know you are. And if they try, don't argue with them, just prove them wrong. Later that evening, as I drove home through the familiar streets of Westchester County, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years earlier. The woman who'd made banana bread for ungrateful family members, who'd accepted criticism as love and control as protection, who'd believed that keeping peace was more important than demanding justice. That woman had been stronger than she'd known, smarter than she'd been given credit for, more capable than anyone had bothered to discover. She'd just needed someone to believe in her enough to fight for her. It turned out that someone had been herself all along. My phone buzzed with a text from Sandra as I pulled into my driveway. "New client tomorrow. Husband hiding assets in cryptocurrency. Could use your help with the financial analysis." I smiled as I read the message, already thinking about the questions I'd ask, the documents we'd need to review, the strategy we'd develop to uncover the truth. Tomorrow, I'd meet another woman who thought she was powerless, and I'd help her discover that quiet wives often know more than their husbands give them credit for. I'd help her learn what I'd learned, that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting angry, it's getting everything. The foundation I established grew faster than I'd anticipated. Within 18 months of my divorce, we were handling cases across 3 counties, providing legal support to women who discovered financial deception in their marriages. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying in ways I'd never experienced during my years as an interior designer. Each case taught me something new about the patterns of financial abuse, the psychology of men who systematically deceive their wives, and the remarkable resilience of women who'd been underestimated for years. There was Margaret, a 62-year-old school principal, who discovered her husband had been funneling their retirement savings into a gambling addiction he'd hidden for a decade. There was Lisa, a young mother who found out her husband had been using their joint credit cards to fund not just an affair, but an entirely separate household with his mistress and their child. The most complex case came through Sandra's office in the spring, 18 months after my own divorce was finalized. A woman named Catherine Montgomery contacted us about her husband Robert, a successful orthopedic surgeon who'd been acting suspiciously about their finances for the past year. Catherine arrived at my office on a Thursday afternoon, impeccably dressed in the way that suggested old money and careful breeding. She was probably 55, with silver hair styled in an elegant bob and the kind of quiet confidence that came from never having to worry about money until recently. "Mrs. Chen," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I'm not sure I belong here. My situation might be different from the women you usually help, Tell me about your situation. Catherine's story unfolded like a financial thriller. Robert had been acting strangely for months, taking phone calls in private, traveling more frequently for conferences, and becoming evasive when she asked about their investment portfolio or retirement planning. He'd always managed their finances, and she'd been content to let him handle the complexities while she focused on her volunteer work and their social obligations. The first red flag had been a letter from their financial advisor, addressed to her personally, asking her to confirm some recent account changes. When she'd asked Robert about it, he'd dismissed it as a clerical error and said he'd handle it directly. But I kept thinking about that letter, Catherine said, so I called the financial advisor myself. What she discovered was that Robert had been systematically moving money out of their joint accounts and into investments she'd never heard of. Not small amounts, but millions of dollars that represented the bulk of their wealth accumulated over 30 years of marriage. The financial advisor seemed nervous when I pressed for details. Catherine continued. He kept saying I should discuss things directly with Robert, that it wasn't his place to explain investment strategies to me. Did you confront your husband? I tried to. Robert said he was just diversifying our portfolio, moving money into higher-yield investments that would benefit us both in the long run. He said I didn't need to worry about the details, that finance wasn't really my area of expertise. Catherine's voice carried a note of bitter recognition. I believed him at first. I've always believed him. But then I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. The things she'd noticed painted a picture of a man preparing for a major life change. Robert had been working out more, updating his wardrobe, and spending increasing amounts of time on his phone. He'd mentioned several times that his medical practice was becoming too stressful, that he was considering early retirement to pursue other interests. Other interests, Catherine repeated. When I asked what those might be, he was vague. Travel, maybe. Writing a book. Consulting work that wouldn't tie him to one location. And you think there's another woman? I think there's another life. Whether there's another woman is almost secondary. Catherine had done some preliminary investigating on her own, discovering that Robert had opened new bank accounts, established a consulting company she'd never heard of, and had been receiving payments from sources she couldn't identify. The most troubling thing, she said, is that he's been telling people we're having marital problems. I found out from our neighbor that Robert told him we might be separating soon, that I'd been impossible to live with since I stopped taking my medication. What medication? I'm not on any medication. I haven't taken so much as an antidepressant in years. But apparently Robert has been telling people I've been unstable, that I've been making irrational accusations about his work and his finances. The strategy was sophisticated and cruel. Robert was laying groundwork to paint Catherine as an unstable wife, whose concerns about their finances stemmed from mental health issues rather than legitimate suspicions. If she tried to challenge him legally, he could point to months of character assassination designed to undermine her credibility. Catherine, I said, how much access do you have to your financial records? Some. I have online access to our main checking and savings accounts, but not to the investment portfolios or the business accounts. And how much do you think your total assets are worth? Robert has always said we're worth about $8 million. Comfortable, but not extremely wealthy. And how much of that $8 million do you have direct access to? Catherine thought for a moment. Maybe $200,000 in the accounts I can see. I made notes while considering the possibilities. Catherine, I think your husband is planning to leave you, and I think he's been systematically moving assets beyond your reach to ensure you get as little as possible in a divorce. But we have a prenuptial agreement that protects both of us equally. Prenups can be challenged if one party has been financially deceptive, but more importantly, if Robert is planning to claim you're mentally unstable, he might be building a case to have you declared incompetent to manage your own affairs. The color drained from Catherine's face. He wouldn't do that. Wouldn't he? Think about the story he's been telling your neighbors. Think about the way he's dismissed your legitimate concerns as evidence of instability. Think about the fact that he's moved millions of dollars without your knowledge, while telling everyone you're the problem. Catherine sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what I'd suggested. Finally, she looked up with the expression of a woman who'd just realized she'd been playing chess while her opponent was playing war. What do I do? We investigate everything, quietly, carefully, and quickly. We document every asset, every account, every business entity he's created. We build a case that proves he's been systematically defrauding you while planning to abandon you. And then we introduce Dr. Robert Montgomery to the concept of consequences. Working on Catherine's case reminded me why I'd started the foundation in the first place. The techniques Robert was using were more sophisticated than what Marcus had attempted, but the underlying psychology was identical. He'd convinced his wife that she didn't need to understand their finances, then used her trust as a weapon against her. The investigation took 6 weeks and involved a team of forensic accountants, private investigators, and legal researchers. What we discovered was staggering in its scope and audacity. Robert hadn't just hidden $8 million. He'd hidden closer to $25 million, accumulated through a combination of his medical practice, real estate investments, pharmaceutical consulting, and business partnerships Catherine had never been told about. More damaging still, Robert had been planning his exit strategy for over 2 years. He'd established a medical consulting firm in Costa Rica, purchased property there under corporate names, and had been gradually transferring assets to accounts in countries with favorable divorce laws for wealthy men, seeking to minimize their obligations to discarded wives. The most disturbing discovery came from his electronic communications, recovered by our computer forensics expert. Robert hadn't just been planning to leave Catherine financially destitute. He'd been consulting with specialists in elder law about the process of having someone declared mentally incompetent, exploring what would be required to gain control over her remaining assets after their divorce. "He was planning to destroy you completely," Sandra said as we reviewed the evidence in her conference room. "Not just leave you, but leave you with nothing and no legal recourse to fight back." Catherine stared at the documents spread across the table with the expression of someone looking at wreckage from her own life. "How long do you think he's been planning this?" "Based on the email timestamps, at least 3 years, possibly longer. 3 years of lying to my face. 3 years of me trusting him while he plotted to destroy me. 3 years of him underestimating exactly who he was married to." I corrected. "Because we're about to show him what happens when the quiet wife stops being quiet." The legal strategy we developed was multifaceted and ruthless. We would file for divorce on grounds of fraud and financial abuse, simultaneously seeking emergency injunctions to freeze all assets and prevent Robert from leaving the country. We would pursue criminal referrals for the forged documents and fraudulent transfers. And we would sue the financial institutions that had allowed him to move money without proper spousal notification. Most importantly, we would demand a full forensic accounting of all assets acquired during the marriage, with the presumption that anything Robert couldn't fully document would be considered hidden marital property subject to equal division. The goal, Sandra explained to Catherine, is not just to recover what you're owed, but to make the process so expensive and public that other men think twice before attempting similar schemes. Catherine nodded slowly. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow morning. We'll serve papers at his office during his surgery schedule, ensuring maximum disruption to his professional routine. And me? What do I do?" "You act normal. You go home tonight, have dinner with your husband, ask about his day. You don't let him know that anything has changed until the process server hands him those papers." That evening, Catherine called me from her home in Scarsdale, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Victoria, I don't know if I can do this." Sitting across from him at dinner, pretending everything is normal, when I know what he's been planning. "You can do it because you have to, because if you give him any warning, he'll find ways to hide assets we haven't discovered yet." "But how do I look at him? How do I make conversation with someone who's been systematically planning to destroy my life? You remember that you're not the same woman you were yesterday. Yesterday you were a victim who didn't know she was being victimized. Today you're a woman with a plan. And tomorrow you're a woman taking action." The next morning, Sandra called me at 9:30 with a report that felt like Christmas morning. "It's done," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Dr. Montgomery was just scrubbing in for a procedure when the process server arrived. According to my contact, he went pale, excused himself from surgery, and locked himself in his office. "And the asset freeze? Judge Williams signed the emergency orders an hour ago. Every account we identified is now frozen pending full disclosure. How quickly will Robert realize the extent of what we know?" Based on the documentation we provided to the court, I'd say he'll figure it out by this afternoon. The criminal referrals will take longer, but the civil case makes it clear that we have evidence of systematic fraud. That afternoon, Catherine received a call from Robert's attorney, a man named David Stern, who specialized in defending wealthy professionals in divorce cases. The conversation was brief and to the point. "Mrs. Montgomery, my client would like to arrange a meeting to discuss an amicable resolution to these proceedings." "How amicable?" Catherine asked, following the script we'd prepared. "Dr. Montgomery acknowledges that there may have been miscommunications about certain financial arrangements. He's prepared to make a generous settlement offer that would avoid lengthy court proceedings." "I'm listening." 50% of all disclosed assets, plus reasonable alimony for a period of 10 years. Catherine looked at me and Sandra across her kitchen table, where we'd been waiting for this call. "Mr. Stern, I think there may be some confusion about the situation. This isn't a negotiation about dividing disclosed assets. This is about recovering hidden assets that my husband has been systematically concealing for years. Mrs. Montgomery, I think you may be overestimating the complexity of your husband's financial arrangements." "Am I? Then perhaps Dr. Montgomery would like to explain the $23 million in offshore accounts that aren't included in his financial disclosure." The line went quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Montgomery, I think we should schedule a formal settlement conference where all parties can discuss these issues in detail. I think that's an excellent idea. Have your office call mine to arrange it." Catherine hung up and looked at us with something approaching amazement. He sounded scared. "He should be scared," Sandra replied. "Robert has exposed himself to criminal liability, professional discipline, and civil damages that could exceed everything he tried to hide." The settlement conference was held the following week at David Stern's office in Manhattan. The conference room was larger than Patricia Vale's had been, with windows overlooking Central Park, and the kind of expensive furniture that suggested very high hourly rates. Robert looked like a different man than the confident surgeon Catherine had been married to for 30 years. He'd lost weight, his color was poor, and there were deep circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. Next to him sat not just David Stern, but 2 other attorneys and a financial advisor who kept consulting thick folders of documents. "Mrs. Montgomery," David Stern began, "my client wants you to know that he deeply regrets the way these financial matters have been handled. He acknowledges that he should have been more transparent about certain investment strategies." "Investment strategies?" Catherine's voice was steady but cold. "Is that what we're calling systematic fraud now?" "Mrs. Montgomery, these are complex financial instruments that most people wouldn't understand without specialized knowledge. Dr. Montgomery was trying to protect the family's wealth by diversifying into international markets." Sandra interrupted. "Mr. Stern, your client forged his wife's signature on multiple documents, moved marital assets into accounts she couldn't access, and has been planning to leave her financially destitute for over 2 years. Let's not pretend this was about portfolio diversification." She spread our evidence across the conference table with practiced efficiency. Bank records, email communications, property deeds, business formation documents, and travel records that painted a comprehensive picture of Robert's deception. "Additionally," Sandra continued, "Dr. Montgomery has been systematically damaging his wife's reputation by telling friends and colleagues that she's mentally unstable, presumably to undermine her credibility if she discovered his activities." Robert's face had gone ashen as Sandra presented document after document. David Stern was taking notes furiously, probably calculating how much of this evidence would be admissible in court and how damaging it would be to his client's case. "What exactly are you seeking?" David asked finally. "Complete asset disclosure, verified by independent audit. Full restoration of all marital property that was transferred without Mrs. Montgomery's knowledge. Punitive damages for the systematic deception. And criminal prosecution for the forged documents." That would essentially leave Dr. Montgomery with nothing. That would leave Dr. Montgomery with exactly what he tried to leave his wife with: nothing. The negotiations continued for 3 hours, with Robert's team gradually acknowledging the extent of his hidden assets while trying to minimize the legal consequences. By the end of the day, we had a preliminary agreement that would give Catherine control of approximately $18 million in previously hidden assets, plus punitive damages for the deception. Robert would keep his medical practice and approximately $2 million in assets, enough to maintain a comfortable but much diminished lifestyle. He would also face professional discipline from the state medical board and potential criminal charges for the forged documents. Most importantly, Catherine would receive a written apology acknowledging the full scope of Robert's deception and taking complete responsibility for the damage he'd caused to their marriage and her emotional well-being. "There's one more thing," Catherine said as the meeting was concluding. "I want Robert to undergo a psychological evaluation to determine his fitness to continue practicing medicine." "Mrs. Montgomery, that seems vindictive," David protested. "A man who could systematically deceive his wife for years while planning to have her declared mentally incompetent might not be someone who should have access to vulnerable patients under anesthesia," Catherine replied calmly. Robert spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. "Catherine, please, you're destroying my entire life." "No, Robert, you destroyed your entire life. I'm just refusing to let you destroy mine in the process." The final divorce decree was signed 3 months later in a courtroom that was much less crowded than mine had been. Catherine had decided against requiring Robert to read his apology publicly, choosing instead to accept a written statement and private admission of guilt. The psychological evaluation had revealed narcissistic personality traits and a pattern of manipulative behavior that the medical board took seriously. Robert's license was suspended for 6 months, and he was required to undergo therapy before returning to practice. More satisfying to Catherine was the professional damage to his reputation. Word had spread through the medical community about his divorce and the financial fraud allegations. Several of his business partnerships dissolved, and his consulting opportunities dried up as colleagues distanced themselves from the scandal. "He'll survive," Catherine told me as we sat in her newly redecorated living room, sipping wine and reviewing the final settlement documents. "But he'll never again be the respected surgeon he was before this began. Any regrets?" "Only that I didn't pay attention sooner. If I'd been less trusting, less willing to let him handle everything, I might have prevented years of deception. Or you might have just discovered it sooner and endured more years of lying about it. Sometimes ignorance protects us until we're strong enough to handle the truth." Catherine's case became a template for the Foundation's work with other clients. We developed protocols for quickly identifying hidden assets, techniques for protecting clients from retaliation, and strategies for pursuing both civil and criminal remedies when appropriate. The publicity from Catherine's case attracted attention from other attorneys and advocacy groups. I was invited to speak at legal conferences about financial abuse in marriage, and several law schools asked me to lecture about the investigative techniques we'd developed. Most rewarding was the stream of women who contacted us after reading about Catherine's story. Some were in situations very similar to hers, married to professionals who controlled all family finances while planning secret exit strategies. Others were dealing with different forms of financial abuse, but all of them had one thing in common. They'd finally decided to stop accepting less than they deserved. 2 years after my own divorce, I was featured in a documentary about financial abuse in marriage. The filmmaker had followed several cases, including Catherine's and 2 others the Foundation had handled. The documentary aired on a major network and generated thousands of calls to domestic violence hotlines from women who recognized patterns in their own marriages. One of those calls came from a woman named Diana Walsh, who reached out to the Foundation after seeing my interview in the documentary. Diana's situation was different from the others I'd handled, but familiar in its fundamental dynamics. Diana was married to James Walsh, a successful investment banker who traveled extensively for work. Over the past 5 years, James had become increasingly controlling about their finances, requiring Diana to account for every expense while giving her no insight into their overall financial picture. "He says it's because I don't understand investments and complex financial instruments," Diana explained during our first meeting. "And he's right, I don't. But I understand when someone is treating me like a child who can't be trusted with information about her own life." Diana's story unfolded over several conversations. James had gradually reduced her access to their accounts, claiming it was for security reasons. He'd insisted that she quit her job as a marketing coordinator, saying his income was sufficient to support them both, and that her working sent the wrong message to his colleagues. Most troubling, James had been having Diana sign documents she wasn't allowed to read, claiming they were routine tax forms or insurance updates that required her signature as his wife. I kept asking to review things before signing, and he'd get irritated and say I was being difficult. He'd say the documents were just legal formalities, and that questioning him showed I didn't trust his judgment. Diana, do you have any idea what you were signing? That's the terrifying part. I don't. It could have been anything. I could have signed away my rights to our house, our investments, even my ability to make decisions about my own medical care. The investigation into James Walsh's finances revealed a level of control that bordered on psychological abuse. He had indeed been having Diana sign documents that gradually reduced her legal rights, including powers of attorney that gave him complete control over her finances and healthcare decisions. More disturbing, James had been systematically destroying Diana's independence by undermining her professional reputation. He'd contacted her former employer and clients, claiming that Diana was having mental health issues and couldn't be trusted with important projects. He'd even gone so far as to create fake social media accounts to post negative reviews of her work, ensuring that she couldn't easily return to her career. This isn't just financial abuse, Sandra told me after reviewing the evidence. This is systematic psychological warfare designed to make Diana completely dependent on him. The legal strategy for Diana's case required coordination between family court, criminal prosecutors, and civil rights attorneys. James had committed multiple crimes in his efforts to control his wife, but he'd also been careful to structure everything in ways that would be difficult to prosecute. The breakthrough came when our computer forensics expert recovered deleted files from James's personal laptop. Among them were detailed notes about his strategy for controlling Diana, including timelines for isolating her from friends and family, plans for undermining her professional reputation, and calculations about how much financial dependence would be required to prevent her from leaving him. He was treating their marriage like a hostile takeover, Sandra observed as we read through James's notes. Every action was calculated to reduce Diana's autonomy and increase his control. The most chilling discovery was a document titled Contingency Planning that outlined James's strategy if Diana ever tried to leave him. He'd prepared false evidence of her alleged mental instability, documented fictional instances of her being violent or threatening, and had even consulted with attorneys about the process of having her involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. Diana, I said when we met to review these findings, your husband wasn't just controlling your finances. He was planning to have you institutionalized if you ever tried to assert your independence. Diana stared at the documents with the expression of someone looking at evidence of her own planned murder. How is this legal? How can someone plan to destroy another person so systematically and face no consequences? It isn't legal, and he will face consequences. The question is how severe you want those consequences to be. Diana's case became the most complex the Foundation had ever handled. James's crimes spanned multiple jurisdictions and involved violations of banking law, tax law, identity theft statutes, and domestic violence regulations. The civil case alone involved claims for financial abuse, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, and conspiracy. The criminal investigation took 8 months and resulted in charges in 3 states. James was arrested at his office, in front of colleagues and clients, just as Robert had been served divorce papers during surgery. The parallels weren't accidental. Public humiliation was part of the consequences these men faced for their systematic cruelty. James's trial became a landmark case for financial abuse prosecution. The evidence of his planning and premeditation was so extensive that he eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a trial that would have resulted in significantly harsher sentences. The civil settlement gave Diana control of assets worth over $12 million, money that James had accumulated during their marriage, while systematically destroying her ability to earn her own living. She also received punitive damages that left James essentially bankrupt, forced to start over with nothing except the legal bills from his criminal defense. Most importantly, Diana reclaimed her professional reputation. We hired a public relations firm to document the systematic campaign James had waged against her career. and several of her former clients reached out to apologize for believing his lies about her mental stability. "The money is important," Diana told me 6 months after her divorce was finalized. "But getting my professional reputation back feels more valuable than anything else." He tried to convince the world I was incompetent, but now everyone knows the only incompetent one was him. Diana's case attracted national attention and led to changes in several state laws regarding financial abuse in marriage. Her story was featured in congressional hearings about domestic violence, and the investigative techniques we developed became part of training programs for attorneys and law enforcement officers. The foundation grew to handle cases in 12 states, with a staff of attorneys, investigators, and support professionals who specialized in different aspects of financial abuse. We developed educational programs for women's groups, trained volunteers to recognize warning signs, and worked with legislators to strengthen laws protecting victims of economic domestic violence. 5 years after my own divorce, I was invited to address the American Bar Association about the evolution of domestic violence law and the growing recognition of financial abuse as a serious crime. Standing at the podium in a ballroom filled with attorneys from across the country, I thought about the woman I'd been when Marcus brought Amber home to our kitchen. That woman had been strong, but she hadn't known it. She'd been smart, but she'd been trained not to use her intelligence. She'd been capable of fighting back, but she'd needed permission to believe she was worth fighting for. The work I did now was about giving other women that permission, helping them understand that quiet wives often know more than their husbands give them credit for, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting angry. Sometimes the best revenge is getting everything and then using it to make sure no other woman has to fight the same battle alone. The foundation continues to grow, handling more cases each year and helping more women discover their own strength. Each story is different in its details but similar in its fundamental truth. Women who've been systematically underestimated often possess exactly the skills needed to bring down the men who thought they could control them. And every time we win a case, every time we help a woman reclaim her life and her dignity, I remember that moment in my kitchen when I chose not to scream or cry or beg for explanation. I chose to pay attention instead. And that choice changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.